There are many kinds of hatred. Some come marching with flags and slogans, eager to be seen. Some slither through generations in whispers, private jokes, zoning meetings, hiring decisions, and the subtle tightening of a smile. Some hatred is crude enough to spit, some is polished enough to hold a wineglass. And then there is the most dangerous kind of all, the kind that calls itself practical, the kind that says it is not cruel, only realistic. Not malicious, only tired, not bigoted, merely done pretending. This is the story of a man who hated people, not because they had harmed him, not because he had reason, but because he was a racist, plain and simple. Yet like many racists, he preferred not to think of himself in those terms. He thought of himself as someone who saw things clearly, someone who wasn't fooled by speeches, or hope, or history's sentimental little fairy tales. He believed the world had been made worse by too much idealism. And one night, in a corner of science no moral civilization should ever finance, he found a machine that offered him the one thing small men always dream of when reality refuses to flatter them: a second chance to vandalize the past. He stepped backward through time, past the neon rot of his own century, past the weary pundits and angry screens, into an America still caught in the great contest between conscience and cruelty. There he saw the hinge on which the future turned: Martin Luther King Jr., not merely a man or a preacher, but a continuing force, a disciplinarian of the soul, a public conscience, a builder of bridges between the hurt and the hopeful. The racist saw none of that, he saw only an obstacle. And because hatred is incapable of creation, it reached for the one thing it has always understood best: destruction. He helped make the assassination happen, not for money, not for country, not even for glory, for satisfaction. Then he returned to the present, a present without the visionary peacemaker, expecting to be rewarded by history. He expected a cleaner world, a quieter one, a less accusing one, a world with fewer racial tensions, fewer social headaches, fewer reminders that his views belonged in the sewer. He expected vindication. Instead, he stepped into a country that felt spiritually underlit. Because the first thing he noticed was the sound. In the world that might have been, the culture had ripened instead of hardened. In the world where King had lived on, the airwaves moved with velvet smooth R&B, conversational spoken word, improvisational jazz, warm funk, lyrical inventiveness, and live instrumentation that made even a casual car ride sound like a city in love with itself. And in the world where King had lived on, hip-hop had grown, yes, but along a brighter, more elegant branch, closer to poetry, wit, rhythm, and ambition than to menace, degradation, or theatrical self-destruction. The mainstream had learned to admire mastery without needing to exoticize it. Black excellence was not something trotted out as a slogan or a seasonal obligation. It was simply woven into the ordinary bloodstream of American life. In that brighter America, the world where King had lived on, Michael Jackson still dazzled, Prince's airs still fused funk and gospel into spectacle. Whitney's voice still rang like crystal, Janet still moved like time made visible, Lionel still wrapped stadiums in warmth, and Diana Ross remained less a memory than a living pillar. And in the world where King had lived on, Living Colors Daring, jazz collectives, poet MCs, theatrical soul reviews, gospel funk orchestras, all of it formed not a niche, but a confident center. The culture did not flatten black artistry into cliché, grievance, or commodity. It let it lead. And because culture shapes aspiration, the rest of life had followed. Programs begun in the late 1960s had not curdled into bureaucracy or patronage. Instead, they had been built with discipline, pride, mentorship, entrepreneurship, and family stability in mind. And in the world where King had lived on, music academies, vocational hubs, business incubators, home ownership incentives, college savings matches, and neighborhood banking networks had turned talent into institutions. Family strengthening policies had supported commitment instead of quietly surrendering to fragmentation. Black home ownership had climbed, education had risen, entrepreneurship had become expectation, not exception. Cross-racial collaboration in music, business, and civic life had ceased to feel like branding and simply become the default. Walk down a main street in that America and you heard a saxophone trading phrases with a passerby. You saw black-owned cafes, engineering firms, fashion houses, publishing imprints, studios, churches with choirs that doubled as orchestras, and neighborhoods once predicted to fail now blooming with civic confidence. Children argued over chord changes at dinner. Teenagers in Iowa knew the same horn charts as kids in Harlem. Family reunions were block parties of recipes, jokes, investment advice, and living memory. In the world where King had lived on, television portrayed black families not as pathologies to be explained, but as dignified human beings to be admired, laughed with, rooted for. The nation had not become perfect, but it had become more graceful, more self-respecting, more grown up. That was the future he destroyed. The present he actually returned to was darker in all the ways he had never bothered to imagine. The music was louder but hollower, more market-tested, less nourishing. What had once been art, capable of lifting a nation's emotional vocabulary, had, in too many corners, been commercialized into posturing, humiliation, contempt, and the glamorization of impulse. Not because one race had failed, but because an entire consumer culture had learned that despair could be monetized, vulgarity could be branded, and alienation could be sold back to the alienated at scale. The neighborhoods were not healed by opportunity but managed by jargon. Family fracture, once a crisis in one zip code, had spread like a national fog across communities of every color. Fathers absent, mothers exhausted, children overdiagnosed, underformed, overentertained, underloved. Institutions had learned to speak endlessly of compassion, while quietly expecting less and less from the very people they claimed to defend. And there it was, the insult dressed up as kindness, the soft racism of low expectations. Not just in relation to black Americans, though there it had done deep damage, but everywhere. Schools that stopped demanding excellence and called it empathy. Media that romanticized dysfunction and called it authenticity. Bureaucracies that substituted dependency for dignity. Elites who mistook patronizing language for moral seriousness. And a professional class so terrified of sounding judgmental that it stopped telling the truth about discipline, commitment, fathers, mothers, study, self-control, and the plain hard virtues without which no culture can remain healthy for long. The racist wandered this present in disbelief. This was not the neat, sterilized world he had imagined. This was not peace, it was fatigue. Racial suspicion had not vanished, it had simply become ambient. Cynicism had not been cured, it had become a style. The old poison had not been removed, it had been aerosolized. Some people screamed their prejudices openly, others performed enlightenment while quietly lowering the bar for whole neighborhoods. Some fetishized grievance, others hid resentment behind jokes, data, or exhausted sighs. Still others monetized the whole rotten spectacle, selling outrage by the hour to a public too tired to remember that life was meant to be more than scrolling through decline. He had not erased conflict, he had erased a teacher. He had not eliminated tension, he had removed a man who might have gone on, decade after decade, calling the nation upward. Martin Luther King, alive into old age in that brighter branch of history, had continued to do what only the rarest public figures ever manage: combine moral seriousness with personal discipline, racial realism with spiritual hope, and tenderness with standards. In that other America, he had not become a relic, but an elder force, rebuking demagogues, resisting cynics, defending family dignity, demanding excellence, praising beauty, protecting aspiration, and refusing to let either racism or victimhood become anyone's religion. Through music, education, business, family policy, and cultural expectation, his influence had continued to lift the tone of the country. He did not save one race from another. He kept America from settling too comfortably into its ugliest instincts. That was the loss. And now the racists saw the consequence of subtraction. Remove a bridge builder, and the bridge does not wait politely for a replacement. Remove a voice of disciplined hope, and the vacuum fills with louder things. Hustlers, nihilists, opportunists, race merchants, soft-headed reformers, hard-hearted reactionaries, professional excuse makers, and 1,000 lesser souls who thrive where standards are mocked and dignity is treated as quaint. He wanted to deny it, then he wanted to rationalize it, then at last he wanted to undo it. In a museum of American history, in a quiet room where school children shuffled past exhibits they barely understood, he found a speculative model, a cultural reconstruction of the future that had been lost. A wall of sound, a wall of neighborhoods, a wall of schools, businesses, songs, families, scholarships, and civic habits that might have matured under the long moral shadow of a living king. Jazz conservatories, mentorship networks, home ownership ladders, orchestras in churches, families at tables, black excellence normalized, cross-racial admiration made ordinary, a nation not cured of sin but less enthralled by it. He stared at the exhibit until the lights dimmed. For the first time in his life he understood what evil really is. Not horns, not drama, not slogans, subtraction, the removal of a good thing so that lesser things may rush in. He had told himself he was cutting out a problem. Instead he had cut out a stabilizer, and the whole culture had wobbled for generations. He had told himself he was correcting history. Instead, he had sabotaged the patient work of reconciliation, aspiration, and mutual admiration before it could finish bearing fruit. He had told himself he was protecting civilization. Instead, he had helped deliver it into a meaner, lazier, more fragmented age. And in the final irony reserved for men whose prejudice outruns their intelligence, he had proven the opposite of his own philosophy. Racism cannot build. It cannot elevate. It cannot produce dignity, family, music, beauty, ambition, or trust. At best it can only damage, delay, degrade, and then pretend the wreckage proves its point. The machine, when he returned to find it, was gone. Or perhaps it was still there and had decided he no longer deserved to see it. In its place stood only a sheet of glass. And in that glass he saw himself clearly at last. Not a realist, not a patriot, not a guardian of civilization, just a racist, a small man with a large grievance, who mistook his resentment for clarity and his vandalism for courage. Meanwhile, the rest of us remain here, in the timeline he helped sour, still faced with the same task every damaged generation inherits: to reject both hatred and condescension, to demand dignity without flattery, standards without cruelty, truth without contempt, and to recover what can still be recovered, in art, in family, in schools, in neighborhoods, in the human voice itself. Because the promise was wounded, but perhaps not dead. And if there is any hope at all, it lies in refusing the cheap seductions of bitterness, whether shouted by racists, marketed by cynics, or padded by the soft velvet of low expectations. That is the lesson he learned too late, in that dim corridor between the better world he destroyed and the lesser one he thought he wanted. In the atomic zone,